Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that even though this is a virtual walk, we're walking on country today, and the City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Willem clan of the Bunwurrung and traditional owners of the other lands on which we're located today. We pay our respect to elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. So let us begin. If you had asked me several weeks ago where I position myself on the 1 to 5 spectrum, I would have been pretty down near the 1 or 2 mark, but I've been able to find an amazing number of resources, but putting them together has resulted in a picture, partial picture, and it's from a range of documentary sources, but also from the personal recollections of people who were quite young during this period. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge those informants from the Port Melbourne History Facebook page who just give that detailed level of nuance to the, the global conflict that was playing out at that time. And although this walk, and I think Mayor Idelson is amongst our attendees, and Mayor is very good at helping us put together the walking topics. And in October 2019, when we came up with this theme, I little knew what lay underneath it. And so I think that were I to reframe the walk today, which is actually going to be more like a presentation, I would have talked about, it would be Port Melbourne and the war in the Pacific. So the focus is very much on the period of the war in the Pacific. But I'm going to begin here with an aerial photograph by Charles Daniel Pratt, and I'll be using a few of his photographs. Now, Pratt himself had been a flyer in the First World War, and when he returned, he made a bit of a career of this very spectacular aerial photography, which is such an aid to historians today, because they're taken at a level of resolution which is really very helpful indeed. But if you take a look at this photograph of Port Melbourne in 1925, the familiar Prince's Pier in the foreground, Station Pier in the background, but you can see from this photograph wasn't a whole lot else happening on our side of Station Pier. And this is the context from which we're going to begin. Because Port Melbourne in the 1920s was very, very severely affected by the 1928 waterfront strike, a bitter dispute after which many people in Port Melbourne didn't work again. Unionised labourers who were dismissed after that waterfront strike, and many of those people didn't work again until the Second World War. The 1928 strike was followed by the Depression, which affected Port Melbourne very, very severely. It was, in the words of Justice Frank Vincent, a difficult, suffering place. But change was afoot. On the other side of Williamstown Road in Port Melbourne, down near the Yarra River, Sir Lawrence Hartnett, I don't know if he was a Sir then, Lawrence Hartnett, who was the General Manager of General Motors Holden, made a very bold, radical decision to move the headquarters of General Motors Holden from City Road in South Melbourne down to Fisherman's Bend. This was, the first industry to open up in Fisherman's Bend. And here you can see the Fisherman's Bend complex under construction, pretty primitive construction equipment led by a horse. So this is just to give you a picture of what Fisherman's Bend was like in 1935. But within 7 months, this is what happened. Here we see the familiar headquarters of General Motors Holden on Salmon Street. Now we are so fortunate through the State Library of South Australia to have in digital form Hartnett's very own photograph album where he recorded the construction of the factory. It was, you know, beautiful red leather-bound volume. You can almost feel you can touch it. But this conveys a sense of the monumental achievement that out of those sand dunes, it created this magnificent headquarters. And just, this is also from Hartnett's album, just to give you a sense of the context in which that factory was located. So once again, nothing much else around, but Hartnett had been very deliberate about choosing that location as being adjacent to the river wharves and Victoria Dock, a highly strategic location. Now, in the early days of General Motors Holden, this was before, of course, Australia's own car was manufactured there. They assembled car bodies, and each year, at the beginning of each year, they'd get sent, you know, they were like dress patterns, but they were actually car patterns, and they had to make those into a bewildering 21 makes of cars and trucks and a total of 75 models. So I'm telling you this quite explicitly because it's relevant later on. So no sooner had Hartnett pulled off this amazing feat of constructing the General Motors Holden factory, then he went on a mission, or he went overseas. This was in the late 1930s. And he visited the Opel car factory, and he was absolutely struck and alarmed by what he observed of the way in which Germany was preparing the whole basis of its industry for war. And he came back, you know, very, very concerned about Australia's lack of military preparedness. And so I think it was quite a sort of small club of prominent people in Victoria in Australia at that time, that he got together all the heads of industry, including Essington Lewis, who was the head of BHP, and they came together to form a consortium to establish an aircraft industry in Australia, because Hartnett recognised that air, you know, having air power was absolutely going to be crucial in any forthcoming conflict. So they were able to lease land adjacent to General Motors Holden, and that was where the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation was established. And many people think that because it's got the word Commonwealth in it, that it was a Commonwealth initiative, but no, it was definitely an initiative of private industry. So once again, they sent someone overseas to do some research on what would be the best aircraft for Australian purposes. And Lawrence Wackett went both to America and to England and checked out all the different planes that were available. And they wanted to source a plane that would be relevant to Australian conditions. Needed to be able to fly long distances, be easy to assemble. So they had a range of quite particular criteria. So when Wackett came back and he recommended this aircraft, which was called the NA-26, was a trainer plane, and here you see it outside the CAC. Now, just an interesting sort of underlying fact about this, where the British were hugely offside, that they had decided to go with an American rather than a British plane. They didn't like the idea that General Motors was so involved and that the Americans had access to, you know, this emerging war technology. But at the same time, and this is relevant to later too, the RAAF were the Air Force in Britain was unable to fulfill orders. So, you know, in a very, very short period of time, this was the training aircraft that became the Wirraway. And the first Wirraway flew from the Commonwealth Aircraft premises on the 27th of March 1939, just before the war. So this is all contextual. So, this has come rather sooner than I'd intended, but I'm going to just show this little bit of video here. And there's a lot of handshaking going on, which no good in Corona times, but I'm just going to fast forward to around here. Oops, I'll just go back a teeny bit. Because there you see Robert Menzies, who was the Prime Minister of Australia in 1940 when war was declared. And here you see these experimental tanks built in Salmon Street at the Department of Aircraft Production, bowling along in Fisherman's Bend. So can you just imagine, you know, living in Port Melbourne at this time and seeing this display? Quite extraordinary. So war was declared, as you would know, in September 1939, and this is just a shot to you know, acknowledge all the people who enlisted to serve overseas, saying their last farewell to Port Melbourne. I'm not going to dwell on this aspect of the war because in many respects in Melbourne, life didn't change too much. Okay, so now we're going to move on here to examine this period in a little more detail. And I'm going to put up another slide just showing some key dates, and I'm going to talk to them just to give a bit more context to what was happening in Australia at this time. So Australia's Prime Minister through most of the war, John Curtin, became Prime Minister on the 7th of October. And less than 8 weeks later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The following day, Australia declared war on Japan. Now, just barely days later, the Repulse was sunk off Singapore. Now, this may not mean a lot to you, but the Repulse had visited, with the Hood, had visited Port Melbourne in 1925 on what was known as the Empire Cruise, a flag-waving exercise for Britain after the war to thank the countries that had supported it during the war, but also as a display of military strength. So the Repulse, it was visited when it came to Port Melbourne by thousands and thousands of people. So it would have been well in the consciousness of Port Melbourne people. And to hear that the Repulse had been sunk would have just conveyed to people the depth of the plight into which Australia was falling. And part of the sinking of the Repulse was there was a belief I've read somewhere like a cultish belief in Fortress Singapore, that Singapore was the Gibraltar of the East, it would never fail, and that Singapore was the key to Australia's defence. But the Japanese were advancing down the Malayan Peninsula at a speed that people just couldn't believe. They had tanks, they had air power, and they just really blindsided England, that just had this faith that was beginning to seem, that was really redundant, that naval power alone would be sufficient, whereas the Repulse was sunk by aircraft in the end and revealed the complete superiority that Japan had in the air. And not long after that, Singapore fell. And I'm not sure if you know, I've just found out that apparently the defence of Singapore was all based around the guns pointing out to sea. So, no one had any apprehension that the attack was going to come from all sides, from the north, but not from the sea. And then just days after that, the attack on Darwin, with which I'm sure you're familiar. So can you imagine Curtin? He felt the weight of this responsibility grievously, because not only had Singapore fallen, which was grave enough, but Australia's two strongest fighting divisions, the 6th and the 7th Division, were still in the Middle East. And so Australia had actually no defence whatsoever. It only had a civilian military force, and they weren't even able to equip it with weaponry. So our vulnerability was supreme. And Curtin, was trying to work all this out with Churchill via cables, and Churchill made a lot of, good sounding offers, but they were really quite hollow. And Churchill himself was devastated by the fall of Singapore. He'd believed in the strategy, and when it fell, he himself fell into a bit of a despond. But meanwhile, Curtin is just anticipating this attack on Australia and firing off cables to Churchill. And Churchill made it absolutely clear that the defence of Europe was number one, and that whatever was happening in the Pacific was of a second order. So it was in this context that a Japanese reconnaissance flight was observed over Port Phillip Bay. Now, this flight was launched from a seaplane off a submarine in King Island, and it did a very, very extensive reconnaissance over Melbourne, often dropping out of the clouds to as low as 300 metres. That was seen by many, many people, and not only was it seen by many people, but he saw warships off Port Melbourne. So was there any wonder that people were living in, with great fear? And so just go back a bit. On the 27th of December 1940, just after Christmas, Curtin made an address to the Australian people, where he said, in a now very famous speech, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. Our task for 1942 is stern." So this is the context. So we now go back to the ground, or no, not the ground yet. We go to another photograph from Charles Daniel Pratt. This one is taken after the war, but it paints the picture. So in 1942, in February or March, American warships that were on the way to the Philippines, where MacArthur was, called in briefly at Port Melbourne. And I'm pretty certain it was in this period that these storage sheds that you see here, all along what is now the boulevard in Port Melbourne, and along Beacon Road and in Garden City Reserve, and see our beacon here, they put up those sheds in double quick time. And if you can see here, those sheds were actually opposite fuel storage tanks and very close to the piers indeed. So these sheds were put here to provision and supply American ships. Now from the air they look large enough, but on the ground they were very, very large sheds. And I have been told that the Port Melbourne city engineer insisted that nothing flammable be stored within those sheds because of their proximity to residential populations. And you'll see here that concurrently the Housing Commission of Victoria was working on this estate, the Fisherman's Bend estate. So there were people living in that estate at this time who would have been, you know, directly opposite this war activity. And so we'll just go in a little bit closer now, another aerial shot showing the sheds along Beacon Road here, the fuel storage tanks. And just if you look at this little cluster of buildings here, that was the mission to seamen. Now it's hardly a surprise to learn that that building, so very close to the piers, occupied a very strategic location. And I believe that a third story was constructed on the mission where American servicemen got up to something. What exactly it was they did, no one knows for certain. But some of the most amazing informants about this period are paper boys. So many men now in their 90s or so, 80s and 90s, were paper boys, and they delivered papers all around the town, and they saw things. They maybe couldn't make sense of things at the time, but they saw things. And one of the things they saw here, which was of great excitement to them, was that at the canteen that was then located in the mission, you could get Coca-Cola. So, having said what I did before, is it any wonder that people living in Port Melbourne were living in fear, terror? They were near the piers, opposite those fuel storage tanks, under imminent threat of invasion. There was a network of air raid wardens, and in Port Melbourne, as in many other suburbs, the air raid wardens supervised the brownouts and gave demonstrations to people as to how to respond in the event of enemy attack. And air raid shelters were dug in public land on Howe Parade and in other reserves in Port Melbourne. And adding to this, you know, fear from above was the fear in Melbourne itself, because Leonski, you may have heard of Leonski, murdered, first of 3 murders, Mrs. Ivy McLeod at the Bleak House Hotel in Albert Park on May the 3rd. So, you know, it must have been a terribly scary time to live in Melbourne. Now, just a bit further along the beach, near Bay Street, in record quick time was erected the HMAS naval establishment. And you'll notice the Art Deco features of the building. Now, this was a naval facility principally set up for training purposes and where people embarked for overseas service. And notice the designation HMAS Lonsdale here on his cap. Now, HMAS Lonsdale was organised like a ship, and I found this recollection where someone said, "We slept in hammocks hung high up in the mess decks over which we lived. The floor became the deck and the ceiling the deck head. The door which led to and from the depot to the street was the gangway. We saluted it every time we came aboard, and we caught the Liberty boat every time we went ashore, even though it only opened onto Rouse Street, Fisherman's Bend." And you'll know that very little recognition, in fact quite hard to find any references to HMAS Lonsdale now, and it was in recognition of that Matt Gregory and colleagues got behind the erection of the statue on the foreshore called Answering the Call. Now we're going to return to Fisherman's Bend, which I just confirm was very much part of Port Melbourne at that time. So here we see that NA16 become a Wirraway, and here it is nearing completion outside the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. And just, you know, it was said to be a simple plane, easy to put together. Nevertheless, there were 4,000 parts in one Wirraway. So next door at General Motors Holden, they were cranking up production for the war effort. And here's just a summary of some of the things that were made by General Motors Holden. And once again, the State Library of South Australia holds an album where they list every single thing that GMH made during the war. But they didn't do it all on their own. What was incredible about the war effort was just how every different producer, whether it was of aluminium or not familiar with the engineering technology, but the die makers, the tools, the pattern makers, everybody was contributing in what was truly a massive feat of coordination. So they were getting aluminium from the plains for New South Wales. It was just an integrated, coordinated affair. And one of the surprising things that they made at GMH were these war boats, work boats, and at its peak, GMH were able to produce a boat every 36 hours. So they were, you know, churning stuff out. Now, one of the things about the war period was how it was a complete incubation for innovation. They couldn't rely on getting materials either from England or from America because of all the danger to shipping. So they really had to turn to local materials, and that led to a complete explosion of innovation. And Hartnett, you know, he found they could create the gun well enough, but when it came to creating the optics, you know, for the eye, the sights, they had to go completely from scratch. So they had to source the expertise, some of it which was found from German people in turn during the war. They had to get the sand, the right quality of sand. And so this is just one example of what was just a very revolutionary period in Australian manufacturing. Another material that was explored for all its properties during this time were Australian timbers, which had not really been used in this way before. And so we go from the one Wirraway to the many. You would have seen this site, I'm sure, over Fisherman's Bend. And over the course of the war, 755 Wirraways were manufactured. But the Wirraway had always been intended as like the foundation plane for an Australian aircraft industry. It was a training plane, it wasn't a fighter. But at that early stage of the war in 1941-42, the Wirraway was all they had. And so they had to add munitions, add guns and so on. And so it made the Wirraway incredibly vulnerable in combat. And they did all sorts of amazing things during the war: reconnaissance, photography, artillery spotting, communications, supply drops and so on. But they didn't fare very well in combat. And only one plane was shot down by a Wirraway, because the Japanese planes were infinitely superior. They were faster, more maneuverable and so on. And it was only as America's aircraft production improved that the war in the air began to turn around. So also in Fisherman's Bend at the Government Aircraft Factory and the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory, more women were employed, I believe, for the Department of Aircraft Production that went on to become the Government Aircraft Factory. A third of the employees were women, and this is obviously a publicity shot, but there's some on the Australian War Memorial website. You'll find some amazing pictures of women working on various construction aspects of the planes. So these women and men were working on the Beaufort, which later went on to become a more effective fighter during the war. So now this is a big one, this next slide we're coming to. Now, we focused quite a good deal on that period in early 1942 when Australia was so exposed, but we're now sort of getting ahead a bit to early 1943, or late 1942 and early 1943, where the Americans had gone on the offensive in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. And this is where some people say the war began to turn round. America was developing superior air capacity, and after that Battle of Guadalcanal, this is what you saw in port. On the evening of the 12th of January and the day of the 13th of January 1943, arrived at Port Melbourne's piers the USS President Jackson, the USS President Adams, the USS President Hayes, and the USS West Point. And they were all wearing the Guadalcanal flash on their uniforms with the Southern Cross on it. And some of those troops were wounded. So I think there were like 18,000 troops overall entering Melbourne at that time. So that must have been quite a thing to witness. So these troops were all here for rest and relax, or rest, R&R, you'd hardly say relaxation, after that Battle of Guadalcanal. So this is where some of them camped. There were camps all over Melbourne and Victoria, but this was the one in Port Melbourne. And I think this is taken sort of more or less from Williamstown Road, looking over towards Dunlops. And this is the tent city that was erected on Northport Oval, there at the Port Footy ground. So this is over the road, you know, completely over the road from where Port Melbourne people were living. And it's said that, you know, the American servicemen would, somebody's house over the road, they'd go in to play pool and piano, and definitely American servicemen were very much around and about, noted for their generosity. They had more money. Port, you know, Port was probably still in quite a state of depression at that time. So the money, the gifts, the fun and dancing. So often when this period's recalled, people think, oh, well, you know, it was all, you know, fun and games. But one of those paper boys observed in a store on the other side of Williamstown Road, a pile of kit bags lying just on the ground, and knowing that those belonged to servicemen who'd never made it back from Guadalcanal. So I'd now like to introduce you to an Australian brother and sister. To the left is Bob Waters. He was a leading sick berth attendant in the Royal Australian Navy, and you can see the Red Cross on his right sleeve. And there he is with his sister, Norma Waters, an independent woman working as a stenographer in the city. And I just included this photograph as much because that photograph on the right is so gorgeous, and showing that even in the midst of war there was some fun going on because they're holding skates, they're going to the glaciarium. But Norma, and along with everyone else, was required to carry an identity card during the war at all times when they were away from home. Rationing had become comprehensive in Melbourne in 1942, and Curtin spoke to the Australian people saying that they must strip themselves of every selfish, comfortable habit, every luxurious impulse, every act, word or deed that retards the victory march. But another dimension uncovered about the Second World War in Port Melbourne was the impact on food production, not just here in Port Melbourne, but throughout Victoria. Because to provision those troops in the Pacific, thousands and thousands of them, you needed to produce food at a scale that had never been produced before. So Australia had largely exported, you know, to England wheat, you know, meat, but not processed food as such, whereas all the food that was required for those troops needed to be canned or dehydrated, something of that nature. And so amongst the personnel sent out here from America were food technologists who, you know, basically took hold of this food production effort and brought it onto more, scaled it up, I suppose you'd say today. So Brooks Lemos, which was a food manufacturing facility in Port Melbourne, they basically, their entire contract was for the services. So this could explain, you know, because so much of Australian production was destined for the UK and for the US and Australian forces, you know, there wasn't really that much left for local people. And it's said that people, you know, took advantage of the proximity to the piers for fishing. So there was coupons and there were rationing for tea and butter, and there was also rationing for clothing. And one of the former members of the Port Melbourne Historical and Preservation Society, who has recently sadly passed away, they were inventive people. They made the most of the situation they were in. And here is a picture of Vera White on her wedding day, looking quite spectacular, but her dress was made from a mosquito net, which had been made into this beautiful dress by her sister. We're now approaching the conclusion as on the 15th of August 1945, Japan surrendered. And you know, one of the amazing things about Port Melbourne is because it's so close to town, you know, we kind of can both have our own story, but also our story that's part of the broader Melbourne and Victorian story. So, you know, Port Melbourne people, of course, joined the victory celebrations in the city, and this just, you know, gives an idea of the jubilation that there was and the relief. The paper boys were hoarse with calling out the news. So in conclusion, we now turn to the legacy questions. So here is the same area we traversed in 1925, in 1945, with its signature cross marking the airways from the combined aircraft factories. We see the industrialisation of Fisherman's Bend, completion of the housing estate. But in 1945, victory may have been achieved, but Australia retained a profound sense of insecurity, which I better understand having followed that history of early 1942. The dictum, you would know, became that we must populate or perish. And this set the stage for what was be Port Melbourne's next phase of history, the great story of post-war migration. Now, before I finish, I want to show you something that is very, very special. And I'll just take a minute to do that. I'll just go to the sources that I've relied upon. Okay, so I'm going to need to stop sharing now. I don't know, can you see me, Sandy?
Yep, you're there.
Okay, now you're not going to, I'm just going to hold this up for a minute. Now you're probably not going to be able to see that at all, but I'll just tell you about it. Recently, I had the good fortune with a colleague from the Port Melbourne Historical Society to visit Jim Sinclair, 93, and born and bred in Port Melbourne, but he served in Papua New Guinea during the war. And during the war, I think it must have been when a conflict was over, he was in a tunnel in Rabaul, and he found this map, the very map that I was showing you. And if you have an opportunity at a later date to view it, it's a map very clearly in Japanese, but with some English notation showing all the soundings, all the streets of Port Melbourne and Melbourne, all the installations, which just make it, you know, only affirm and confirm that, you know, an invasion at one time was certainly contemplated. You know, there were various reasons at the Japanese end why it didn't proceed, but I hope this presentation has given you a sense that at one time Port Melbourne and Australia did consider itself at mortal threat of invasion, and I'd just like to thank every person who fought and contributed to ensure that that was not the case.